The Roman legionary. This image alone conjures up a picture of iron discipline, indestructible might, and ruthless efficiency. We see an army marching through sun-scorched deserts and snow-covered forests, building roads, bridges, and entire cities, and crushing any resistance in its path. These soldiers conquered half of the known world, creating an empire that stood for 1,000 years. But what power fueled these men? What fuel allowed them to walk 30 kilometers a day with a full lining weighing 40 kilograms, and then with their bare hands to build overnight a fortified camp that could withstand the attack of an entire tribe? The answer lies not only in discipline and training, but also in their camping cauldron. And what was in there may surprise you greatly. It wasn't the diet of gladiators or the gourmet viands of patrician feasts. It was an elaborate, standardized, and incredibly efficient food system that was as much a weapon of Rome as the short sword gladius or the throwing spear pilum. Are you ready to look inside a legionary's marching bag and learn why his staple drink would be vinegar torture to us? What secret sauce he added to any meal? And why a loaf of bread was more important than a paycheck? The answers to these questions will reveal one of the major secrets behind the success of the greatest army in history. The basis, foundation, and main driving force of the entire Roman army was grain. Not meat, not vegetables, but grain. The legionary was essentially a carbohydrate-powered machine, and grain was its high-octane fuel. Each soldier received a daily ration known as a nona, and it was grain that made up the lion's share of that ration. This supply system, known as a nona militaris, was a marvel of ancient bureaucracy and one of the main pillars of the state. Why grain? The answer lies in its ingenious simplicity and efficiency. First, it is incredibly caloric and nutritious. It provided the slow, steady energy needed for long marches and hard physical labor, such as digging ditches or building camps. Second, it was cheap. Wheat and barley could be grown in vast quantities throughout the empire. Entire provinces such as Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily served as bread baskets, their primary purpose being to supply Rome and its legions. Grain was collected as a tax, paid in kind rather than in money, making it easier to gather resources for the army. Thirdly, and most importantly from a logistical point of view, grain stored very well. In dry form, it could lie in specially built barns hories for months or even years without spoiling. It was relatively easy to transport in sacks on wagons or ships. No other product combined these three key qualities. The main type of grain was wheat, especially the hard varieties, Triticum durum. It was what made the best bread and porridge. But in regions where wheat grew poorly, such as northern Britain, or as a punishment, soldiers could be given barley. To the Romans, barley was considered livestock fodder, and putting a legion on barley rations was a sign of disfavor and humiliation. After rebellion or cowardice in battle, a unit could be decimated, 1 in 10 executed, and survivors were forced to live outside the camp rampart and eat barley, an indelible disgrace. Each soldier received approximately 850 grams, about 3 Roman pounds, of grain per day. This may seem like a huge amount, but it must be remembered that a legionary burned up to 6,000 calories a day during active campaigns. This ration alone provided about 3,000 calories. It is important to realize that this ration was not issued in the form of cooked bread. It was the grains that the soldiers received. This was done for practical reasons. Grain lasts longer than flour or bread, and so there was less chance of it spoiling or being stolen, which meant that each soldier had to turn that grain into food himself. He carried with him a small hand millstone, mola manuaria, 2 round stones weighing several kilograms, which were part of his compulsory baggage. Every evening after a long march, he would sit down and begin the hard, monotonous work of grinding his portion. This daily routine was as integral to a soldier's life as cleaning his weapons or repairing his sandals. Grain was not just food, it was the strategic foundation of Rome's power. Once a soldier received his daily portion of grain, he had to cook it. And although we associate Rome with bread, baking fresh loaves in the field, especially during a fast march, was nearly impossible. Therefore, legionaries had several other, more practical and quicker ways to consume their main source of calories, turning it into different dishes depending on the situation. The simplest, oldest, and in its own way, homemade dish was poules. Pools. It is a thick porridge or pasta that can be considered the ancestor of Italian polenta and the national dish of archaic Rome. Coarsely ground grains, most often spelt or wheat, were simply boiled in water with salt until a thick, hearty mass was obtained. It was a basic dish, a base to which anything could be added to make it tastier and more nutritious. Some crumbled hard cheese, cassis, garlic, onions, wild herbs, or bits of salted meat. Pulse was a warm, easily digestible, and very energy-dense food. A perfect supper after a long day that kept you warm and made you feel full. However, the main marching food was buxaletum, or soldiers' breadcrumbs. It was the forerunner of all army galettes and ship's breadcrumbs in history, a food designed for maximum longevity. Grain was ground into flour, kneaded into a simple dough with water and salt, and then baked into hard, dry flatbreads or rings. These cakes were then baked again, hence the Latin biscoctus, twice baked, from which the word biscuit is derived, to evaporate all the moisture from them. The result was a product as hard as stone, which could be stored for months without molding. It was almost impossible to chew bucalatum dry. You could break your teeth. Usually it was soaked in water, wine, pasca, or broth, turning it back into a kind of porridge. A few of these breadcrumbs in a marching bag were an inviolable store of energy on any march when there was no time or opportunity to build a fire. Of course, when a legion stood in a stationary camp or fortress, it was possible to bake real bread. Every major camp had its own bakeries with large stone ovens. The bread was coarser and denser than we are used to, often with bran, without yeast on sourdough. It was called panis militaris, soldier's bread. Sometimes soldiers in their contubernia could build a small clay oven and bake bread for themselves. To get a loaf of fresh, warm bread instead of hard breadcrumbs was a real luxury for a soldier and a sign of stable, organized service. Thus, a soldier's grain ration was a versatile raw material that could be used to make hot porridge for supper, hard breadcrumbs for a long march, and complete bread while stationed. This flexibility was another key to the effectiveness of the Roman army. When we think of drinks in ancient times, water and wine come to mind, but a Roman legionary had a special drink that was as important as his sword or shield. This drink was called pasca, and it was not just a way to quench thirst, but a real sports drink of antiquity, an ingenious invention, perfectly suited to the needs of the soldier, which fulfilled several vital functions at once. What is pasca? At its core, it is a mixture of water and sour wine or wine vinegar. While quality wine was served to officers and rich men, cheap sour wine, acatum, which was no longer suitable for drinking in its pure form, was used for the production of pasca. It was diluted with water in a certain proportion. Sometimes honey or herbs, such as coriander or mint, could be added for flavor. To modern man, the idea of drinking water with vinegar may seem like torture, but for the Roman soldier, pasca was vital for several reasons. First, safety. The quality of drinking water on a campaign was a huge issue. Rivers and lakes could be contaminated, causing dysentery and other intestinal diseases that could incapacitate an entire legion faster than enemy swords. The acetic acid found in pasca is a mild antiseptic. Adding it to water killed some of the harmful bacteria, making the drink much safer. It was a simple and effective way to sanitize. Second, hydration. Pasca was an excellent thirst quencher, better than plain water. The sour taste stimulated salivation and was subjectively refreshing in the heat. Modern research shows that drinks with low electrolyte and acid content actually help the body absorb water better. In essence, it was a primitive isotonic that helped restore water and salt balance after hours of marching under the scorching sun. Third, calories and vitamins. Wine vinegar contains potassium and traces of vitamin C, which was good for a body undergoing tremendous physical exertion and served as a prevention of scurvy. Pasca was an official part of a soldier's ration. It was issued as regularly as grain. The logistics were simple. Concentrated vinegar was transported in barrels and diluted with water on the spot. Each legionary carried a flask, laguncula, with this drink. According to the Gospel, it was pasca that a Roman soldier offered to the crucified Christ on a sponge. And it was not an act of mockery, but a gesture of compassion, an offer of a common soldier's drink to quench unbearable thirst. In addition to pasca, of course, Soldiers also drank plain water when they were sure of its purity. Wine in its pure form was more of a reward or part of the festive ration. Beer, popular with barbarian peoples, such as the Celts and Germans, was despised by the Romans as a coarse and unworthy beverage. However, in the northern provinces, where grapes did not grow, legionaries had to adapt and consume the local beer, cervicia, as evidenced by the findings at Fort Vindolanda. Although grain was the mainstay of the diet, Roman commanders were well aware that soldiers needed protein to maintain their strength and morale. Therefore, meat, albeit in smaller quantities than grain, was a mandatory part of the soldiers' menu. The main type of meat included in the official ration was pork, and for good reason. Pigs grow quickly, are unpretentious in eating, and give very fatty, calorie-rich meat. But most importantly, pork is very easy to preserve. Fresh meat under camping conditions is a logistical nightmare. It cannot be stored for long periods of time. Therefore, soldiers received pork in salted or smoked form. Most often, it was bacon or corned beef. Salt and smoke were the main preservatives of antiquity. Such products could be stored for weeks and months and were easy to transport. A piece of salted pork added to a cauldron of pullet porridge turned a bland dish into a hearty and flavorful dinner. In addition to pork, beef, goat, and mutton were also included in the diet, especially when the legion passed through regions with developed cattle breeding. Often whole herds of cattle accompanied the army and served as live canned food. They were slaughtered as needed, providing fresh meat for the soldiers. But official rations were only one side of the coin. Hunting played a huge role. The legionnaire was not only a warrior, but also a prey. During halts on the march or during long stays, soldiers actively hunted any available game: deer, wild boars, hares, wild birds. Everything went into the pot. Hunting not only diversified the diet, but also was an excellent training of combat skills, tracking, and weapons. The right to hunt was an important privilege. In addition, soldiers consumed any accidental squirrel. Fishing in rivers and lakes was a popular pastime. More exotic foods were not squandered either. Archaeological finds in Roman forts show that soldiers ate oysters, mussels, and other mollusks if they stood near the coast, as well as edible snails, which were sometimes even specially bred. Frogs could also go for food. For a soldier thousands of miles from home, any source of protein was valuable. The Roman army was too pragmatic to feed its soldiers on grain and meat alone. Warlords intuitively understood the importance of vegetables and herbs in preventing disease and maintaining health. Therefore, green rations, though not as standardized as grain rations, played a huge role. The official supply included mainly those vegetables that were well stored and easily transported. Onions and garlic were the undisputed leaders here. They were valued not only for their sharp flavor, which enlivened unleavened food, but also for their antiseptic properties. The Romans believed that garlic gave strength and warded off disease. Every soldier carried several heads of garlic with him. Other important vegetables were cabbage, turnips, carrots, and various legumes. Lentils, peas, beans. When dried, they could be stored for a very long time and were an excellent source of protein and fiber. They were added to porridge and chowder. However, most fruits and vegetables were not centrally supplied to the soldiers' table, but were locally sourced. When the legion stood in a long-term camp, vegetable gardens were set up around it, where soldiers grew leafy greens, lettuce, cucumbers, and other perishable vegetables in their spare time. This not only improved nutrition, but was also a form of occupational therapy. Collecting played a huge role. Soldiers, being mostly from the countryside, had an excellent knowledge of wild plants. They gathered edible herbs, nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, roots, wild berries, and mushrooms. This was a vital skill, especially in unfamiliar terrain. Fruit was also an important part of the diet. In the southern provinces, these included figs, grapes, and dates, which stored well when dried and were an excellent source of quick energy. In the northern regions, wild apples, pears, and plums were harvested. This combination of centralized supplies and local food extraction made the soldiers' diet remarkably flexible and balanced, as much as was possible in those conditions. Onions, garlic, and cabbage were not just food, but preventive medicine, protecting the army from scurvy and other avidominosis. Even the most nutritious food can be torture if it is bland and tasteless. The Romans understood this very well. That's why a soldier's ration included 3 key flavor enhancers, the 3 pillars of Roman cooking, which turned a simple porridge into a complete meal and were as important as the main foods. The first and foremost element was salt. In a world without refrigerators, salt was not just a condiment, but a strategic resource, the main preservative. But its flavor role cannot be underestimated either. Salt made any food more appetizing. Its importance was so great that the very word soldier, comes from the Latin solidus, a coin that was used to pay a salary, part of which was intended to buy salt, salarium. Salt was part of the soldier's salary, his salt money. The second indispensable product was olive oil. For the Mediterranean world, oil was everything, a source of fat, a cosmetic, fuel for lamps and medicine. Soldiers received regular rations of olive oil. It added calories and flavor to porridge and chowder. They could fry things with it. It was used to lubricate the skin to protect it from the sun and wind. Good quality olive oil was a sign of a good supply. But the most surprising and truly Roman ingredient was garum, or liquamen. It was a fermented fish sauce that was to the Romans what ketchup or soy sauce is to us today. It was made by salting small fish with giblets and blood and leaving it to ferment in the sun for several months. The result was a salty, spicy, protein and amino acid-rich liquid with a very strong, specific odor. This recipe sounds wild to us, but to the Romans, garum was the flavor of the house. It possessed the so-called fifth flavor, umami. Just a few drops of this sauce turned an unleavened chowder into a rich, flavorful dish. Garum was produced on an industrial scale throughout the empire and supplied to the army in sealed amphorae. It was not only delicious but also healthy, as it contained many minerals and protein. For a legionary stationed in cold and damp Britain, a spoonful of garum in hot porridge was not just a condiment, but a little piece of the sunny Mediterranean. Salt, butter, and garum were the trinity that made a soldier's food edible and even delicious in its own way. The Roman army's ability to feed efficiently for long campaigns away from home was the result not of chance, but of one of the most sophisticated systems of military logistics in the ancient world. Logistics was as much Rome's weapon as its legions. It was what allowed an army to operate where any other army of the time would have starved to death. At the heart of the system was a network of roads. The famous Roman roads were built primarily for military purposes, to move troops quickly, and just as importantly, for supplies. Caravans of wagons with grain and other supplies could move uninterruptedly along these roads. A network of military warehouses and granaries, horea, was created all along the borders of the empire and in key provinces. They stored grain, wine, oil, and other supplies for many months to come. When a legion went on campaign, it could replenish its supplies at these bases. Supply was accomplished in several ways. Centralized supplies from Italy and other provinces came by sea and rivers, and then by road. Special officials and military intendants were responsible for this. Local procurement was another important source. The army bought food from the local population, which stimulated the economy of the conquered provinces. But a harsher method, requisitioning, was also often used. In times of war, the army had the right to forcibly seize food from the local population. This, of course, caused hatred, but allowed to quickly solve supply problems. Each legion had its own huge convoy of hundreds of mules and wagons, which carried not only siege vehicles and tents, but also provisions. However, the Romans realized that a large cortege would slow down the army. Therefore, each legionary carried a significant portion of his provisions on his own. Trajan's famous column depicts soldiers with saws, pickaxes, and hiking sacks. In these sacks, they carried their rations of grain or breadcrumbs for several days. Hand millstones, a kettle, and a flask. This made each soldier partly self-sufficient and allowed the legion to make quick marches away from the main pack. This system, which combined centralized planning, extensive infrastructure, and the soldier's personal responsibility, was the secret of invincible Roman logistics. So how did all this massive food turn into a hot meal for thousands of soldiers? The cooking system in the Roman army was as well organized as anything else and was based on the main tactical unit of the legion. The legion was divided into cohorts into centuria, and centuria into contubernium. The contubernium was the smallest unit, consisting of 8 soldiers who lived in one tent. It was the contubernium that was the basic kitchen cell. Soldiers of one contubernium received rations together, ground grain together, and cooked meals together. Each contubernium had its own cooking kit, a bronze cauldron for boiling, a spit for roasting meat if possible, and one mule in a cart that carried their tent, millstones, and other common equipment. In the evening, after setting up camp, the soldiers would build a fire and cook dinner in a communal cauldron. This was a collective duty. One chopped wood, another built the fire, and a third prepared the food. Eating together strengthened the bonds of camaraderie, turning the 8 strangers into a true fighting family. In addition to the common cauldron, each soldier had his own personal canteen set. It consisted of several items. The main one was the patera, a small flat bowl or frying pan with a long handle. It was a universal tool. In it, you could heat a portion of porridge, fry a piece of meat, and use it as a plate. The soldier also had a simple clay or wooden mug and a spoon. The Romans did not know forks. They ate mostly with spoons or their hands. This personal kit, called a vasa, was carried by the soldier. It was made of simple and durable materials: bronze, iron, clay. Archaeologists find such bowler hats and paterae throughout the former Roman Empire, often with the owner's name scratched into them. These simple objects are mute witnesses to countless soldiers' fireside dinners, from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the banks of the Euphrates. Its simplicity and functionality made it possible to quickly feed a vast army while maintaining order and morale. A soldier's life was harsh, but it did not consist of mere weekdays filled with marching and porridge. There was room for holidays and special incentives that played a huge role in maintaining morale. On these days, the standard ration could vary considerably. The main occasions for feasting were religious festivals and victories. On major feasts, such as Saturnalia or the emperor's birthday, soldiers were given special, improved rations. This could be quality wine instead of the usual pasca, fresh meat, often from sacrificial animals, and better bread. Commanders realized that celebrating together and eating good food brought soldiers closer together and made them feel part of the great and caring imperial machine. A major victory or the successful completion of a campaign was also celebrated in a big way. A commander could throw a grand feast for his legions. This was not only a way to celebrate success, but also a gesture of gratitude to the soldiers for their bravery and fortitude. Such feasts are depicted in bas reliefs, such as Trajan's Column, where scenes of provision distribution and celebration can be seen. Food was also part of the reward system. In addition to cash bonuses and medals, failures, distinguished soldiers or entire units could be rewarded with an extra portion of wine, cheese, or meat. This was a simple but very clear and effective form of reward. In some cases, soldiers could also be given delicacies. For example, garrisons on the coast regularly received oysters, which were considered a gourmet dish in Rome. Letters found at the site of Fort Vindolanda in Britain contain lists of purchases that include pepper, honey, and other expensive condiments, which suggests that even at the far frontiers of the empire, soldiers and officers tried to diversify their table. Of course, it all depended on the commander and the specific situation. In one legion could serve a generous commander who cared about his men, and in another, stingy and cruel, who appropriated the best products. But the very possibility of a feast, the very hope that after a hard fight you would be rewarded with a piece of roast meat and a mug of good wine, was a powerful psychological stimulus that helped soldiers endure all the hardships of service. The Roman supply system was great, but it wasn't flawless. During protracted sieges, difficult campaigns in the wilderness, or due to miscalculations by commanders, logistical chains could break down. And then for the legionnaire, the real struggle for survival began, where the standard diet was replaced by a harsh diet of desperation. When supplies ran low, the first order of business was to cut rations. Then the army would turn to whatever local resources were available. They began an all-out harvest of everything edible. Soldiers dug up roots, gathered wild herbs, berries, mushrooms, acorns. Any stream or river became the object of close attention. Fish, frogs, crayfish were caught. If even this was not enough, they used to eat animals, which in ordinary life were not considered as food. First of all, they slaughtered transport animals, mules and oxen. Their meat was tough, but it was meat. Then came the turn of horses, even cavalry war horses, which was a sign of extreme desperation. During the famous siege of Alesia, Julius Caesar's troops, who had surrounded the Gauls, were themselves encircled and experienced terrible starvation. Caesar, in his Notes on the Gallic War, describes how his legionaries survived by eating grain they collected in the fields between the two lines of fortifications, risking their lives. When the situation became desperate, the most extreme measures were resorted to. The historian Plutarch describes instances during Mark Antony's Parthian campaign when starving soldiers ate their fallen comrades. Although cannibalism was an absolute taboo, in the face of total collapse, it became the last chance of survival. A more common practice was to eat the skin. Soldiers boiled their leather sandals, collegiae, belts, shield covers, and horse harness to get some nutritious broth. They scraped and ate the bark off the trees. It was no longer a meal, but an attempt to trick the stomach and delay starvation for another day. These grim episodes remind us that behind the splendor of Roman victories was a harsh reality. The legionary was prepared for anything. He was trained not only to win, but to survive in the most inhumane conditions. And his ability to go from soldiers' rations to a diet of roots and boiled skin was another final weapon in his arsenal. The diet of the Roman soldier was a marvel of military engineering and pragmatism. It was not just food, but a carefully calculated system designed to maximize the fighting ability of a vast army under any conditions. It was caloric, mobile, and, as far as possible, balanced. We saw that the basis of nutrition was grain, which was transformed from a hearty porridge to a hard as a stone. We learned that instead of water, the soldiers drank pasca, a sour but safe and refreshing drink. We realized that their diet was supplemented with salted pork, game, vegetables, and the ubiquitous garum fish sauce that gave flavor to their simple food. Behind it all was a powerful system of logistics that was as much the key to victory as iron discipline. The legionary diet is a story not of culinary sophistication, but of efficiency. It reflects the very essence of Rome: pragmatism, organization, and adaptability. Every calorie counted, every product fulfilled its function. As we study a soldier's cauldron, we realize that the Roman Empire was built not only by the sword, but also by bread. If this trip to the field kitchen of the Roman legions was interesting for you, and you want to learn more about the real life of people in the greatest empires of the past, put a like and subscribe to our channel. A lot more amazing and unexpected stories hidden behind the pages of textbooks are waiting for you ahead.